Saturday, January 3rd, 2026, 2 a.m. In the sprawling barrios of Caracas, the city is asleep. But in the sky above, the atmosphere is about to be torn apart. To the millions of people on the ground, it looked like the end of the world. The night sky, usually empty, was suddenly filled with the roar of 150 combat aircraft. Explosions rocked the perimeter of the capital, shaking the valley floor. The horizon burned. To any observer, civilian or soldier, this could only mean one thing: invasion. The world woke up screaming. Global markets panicked. Embassies went into lockdown. The news cycles began churning out headlines about a massive US military assault, a blunt force hammer striking the Venezuelan regime. But the eyes of the world were deceived. While the sky burned and the cameras focused on the explosions, the real war was happening in the dark. It was happening in the silence found between the bomb blasts. While 150 jets created a diversion of biblical proportions, a small flight of helicopters from the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, were skimming the waves of the Caribbean. They were flying dark, no lights, no communications. They were ghosts, slipping under the radar of a nation that was looking up at the fireworks. 3 hours later, the President of Venezuela, the man who had defied sanctions, survived coup attempts, and outlasted international pressure for over a decade, was sitting in handcuffs on the deck of a US warship. This is the story of the most audacious special operations raid in modern history. It wasn't a war, it was a kidnapping. It was a heist performed on a geopolitical scale. And to pull it off, the United States didn't just need firepower. They needed a magic trick. They needed to build a sonic shield. The operation, militarily designated as Operation Absolute Resolve, did not happen in a vacuum. It was the climax of a months-long pressure campaign known as Operation Southern Spear. The strategy was simple: constriction. Like an anaconda, the United States slowly squeezed the life out of the Venezuelan coast. In late 2025, the US Navy parked a massive armada off the coast of Venezuela. The Carrier Strike Group 4 and the USS Iwo Jima Amphibious Ready Group arrived with little fanfare but undeniable presence. These weren't just ships. They were floating air bases, command centers, and floating hospitals. The official pretext was counter-narcotics. The US Department of Justice had long designated the Venezuelan government a narco-terrorist state. The narrative was that the Venezuelan leadership, specifically the Cartel of the Suns, was flooding the United States with cocaine and fentanyl. By framing the naval buildup as a law enforcement action against drug trafficking, Washington avoided the political complications of declaring war. They weren't invading a country. They were setting up a crime scene perimeter. 8 guided missile destroyers patrolled the horizon. 3 amphibious assault ships, effectively small aircraft carriers, loitered just outside territorial waters. They turned the Caribbean into a command and control juggernaut. They were listening to every radio frequency. They were mapping every radar pulse. They were watching. But ships can only see the coast. To get the target, you need eyes inside the palace. The intelligence war was the invisible precursor to the kinetic strike. The CIA and other intelligence agencies had been hunting Nicolás Maduro for years, but he was a hard target. Maduro was paranoid. He moved constantly. He slept in different bunkers. His security detail, trained by Cuban intelligence, was expert at counter-surveillance. But intelligence sources reveal that the CIA had achieved a breakthrough. They had a spy inside Maduro's inner circle, This asset provided the pattern of life analysis. They pinpointed a specific safe house within the massive Fort Tiuna military complex in Caracas. They knew when he arrived, when he slept, and critically, how long it took his security detail to react to a threat. In the pine forests of North Carolina, Delta Force operators went to work. They built a full-scale replica of the safe house. They rehearsed the raid hundreds of times. They practiced in the day. They practiced at night. They practiced with gas masks. They practiced until they could clear the building by muscle memory alone. They were ready. The team was ready. The ships were ready. But there was one problem. Between the US Navy and that bedroom in Fort Tiuna stood one of the deadliest air defense networks on the planet. To understand the audacity of this operation, you have to understand the threat. Venezuela is not a defenseless nation. Ironically, some of its teeth were sharpened by the United States. In 1982, under the Peace Delta program, Venezuela became the first Latin American country to buy the F-16 Fighting Falcon. They bought 24 of them. Today, only about 5 are operational, cannibalized for parts due to sanctions. But the F-16s were never the real problem. The real problem was Russian. Over the last decade, Venezuela spent billions turning its airspace into a fortress. They purchased the S-300VM Ante 2500 anti-ballistic missile system. The S-300 is a beast. It is mobile, it is powerful, and it is smart. Its radar can track up to 24 targets simultaneously and guide 4 missiles to each of them. It can hit aircraft at high altitudes and cruise missiles hugging the terrain. Layered underneath the S-300s were the Buk M2E medium-range systems, what NATO calls the Grizzly. These can pop up, fire, and relocate in minutes. And beneath those, thousands of shoulder-fired manpads, Igla-S, and anti-aircraft guns. And recently, a new threat had emerged: Iranian Shahed drones. Used for reconnaissance and kamikaze strikes, these drones acted as a tripwire. If you flew low to avoid the radar, the drones would see you. If you flew high, the S-300s would kill you. Military planners ran the simulations. Sending in standard 4th-generation fighters like the F-16 or F-A-18 would result in high attrition. In plain English, pilots would die. The S-300, supported by Chinese radar technology, would pick them off before they even crossed the coastline. They needed a plane that could exist inside the enemy's kill box without being seen. They needed the F-35 Lightning II. The F-35 is often criticized for its cost, but in a scenario like this, it is priceless. It is the only aircraft in the US arsenal capable of dismantling an integrated air defense system, IADS, like Venezuela's, without firing a nuclear weapon. Its stealth geometry makes it appear the size of a golf ball on enemy radar. But hiding wasn't enough. The mission required the F-35 to actively fight the electromagnetic spectrum. Using its advanced electronic warfare suite, the F-35 can detect an enemy radar's frequency and blast it with jamming noise. It can create ghost targets, false blips that confuse the operators. It can blind the S-300, leaving the Venezuelan crews staring at static. The logistics of the air campaign were staggering. The primary strike force launched from Puerto Rico, over 800 miles away. To keep the pressure on, the US set up a clockwise rotation. Fighters would fly down, enter the combat zone, expend their electronic warfare capabilities, and then rotate out to aerial tankers waiting in safe airspace. It was a conveyor belt of air dominance. For the immediate, time-sensitive strikes, the US utilized the F-35B, the vertical takeoff variant, launching from the amphibious ships just off the coast. These jets could reach downtown Caracas in 10 minutes. The plan was set. The assets were in place. The target was asleep. It was time to execute. Hour 0, 2 a.m., Venezuelan Standard Time. The first blow didn't come from a pilot. It came from the sea. Cruise missiles and F-35 precision strikes slammed into the eyes of the Venezuelan military. Radar stations along the coast went dark. Communication nodes were vaporized. Then came the noise. 150 aircraft, F-35s, F-22s, and B-1 bombers filled the sky. They struck the La Carlota airbase in the heart of the city. They struck the command centers at Fort Tiuna. This was the sonic shield. The goal was not to flatten Caracas. It was to create a sensory overload. The explosions, the sonic booms, the screaming engines. It was designed to be deafening. It was a wall of sound, meant to mask the subtle, rhythmic thumping of rotor blades. It worked. The Venezuelan military panicked. Their radios were jammed with static. Their commanders were screaming orders that no one could hear. Their anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the night sky, chasing shadows. And in that chaos, the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment slipped the leash. Flying MH, 6 Little Birds, and specialized stealth Blackhawks, they crossed the coastline. They flew nap of the earth, hugging the terrain, skimming rooftops, flying below the engagement radar of the S-300s. The citizens of Caracas, huddled in their homes, felt the ground shake from the bombs, but they never heard the helicopters passing just feet above their apartment blocks. The team approached the target. The sonic shield held. The sky was screaming so the ground could be silent. The operators checked their weapons. The green light flickered on. The deception was complete. Now, it was time for the violence. 2:15 a.m., the courtyard of the safe house in Fort Tiuna. While the Venezuelan military was looking up at the burning sky, the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment set the Delta Force operators down, right on the doorstep of the presidency. The sonic shield had worked. The perimeter guards were distracted, their eyes fixed on the explosions at the nearby airbase. By the time they realized the threat was inside the wire, it was too late. The breach was violent and surgical. Using specialized thermal cutting charges and explosives, the operators blew the main doors. They flooded into the fatal funnel. Inside, the resistance was desperate. The Venezuelan Presidential Guard, Maduro's Praetorian Guard, opened fire, but they were fighting blind. The US operators, equipped with panoramic night vision goggles and fused sensor data, owned the darkness. Outside, the air support arrived. Attack helicopters hovered just meters above the compound, laying down a curtain of suppression fire that pinned the defenders to the floor. The resistance was described by Pentagon officials as swift but futile. The assault team moved to the residential wing. They didn't check every room. They knew exactly where to go. The intelligence had been perfect. They found him. Nicolás Maduro. The man who had survived drones, assassins, and elections was standing in his living quarters, reportedly frozen in shock and awe. Beside him was his wife, Kilia Flores. There was no negotiation. There were no Miranda rights read. In seconds, the high-value targets were physically secured. The raid had taken less than 15 minutes. Jackpot. The code word went out over the encrypted network, but capturing the president was only half the mission. Now, They had to get him out of a city that was waking up and realizing it was under attack. The helicopters lifted off, heavy with their cargo. They didn't return to a base in Colombia or Brazil. They turned north, heading straight out to sea. Flying low over the Caribbean, the team rendezvoused with the USS Iwo Jima. The amphibious assault ship was waiting in the darkness, a floating fortress. US officials would later release this photo, the first proof of life. It showed Maduro on the deck of the Iwo Jima. The dictator was no longer a head of state. He was cargo. From the ship, he was transferred to a fixed-wing aircraft and flown to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. It was a symbolic pit stop. The US naval base at Guantanamo has long been a thorn in the side of the Latin American left. For Maduro, passing through its gates must have been a bitter irony. He didn't stay long. He was loaded onto a heavy transport plane for the final leg of the journey, 2,100 miles north to the winter cold of New York. Saturday afternoon, Stewart Air National Guard Base, Orange County, New York. The transport plane touched down. The tropical heat of Caracas was a world away. He was flown by helicopter into New York City, the financial capital of the world. The destination was the headquarters of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. Then came the moment the US government had choreographed for the world to see, the perp walk. The White House released the video on social media with a 2-word caption: Perp walked. It was a deliberate humiliation. By parading him in handcuffs like a common street dealer, the US stripped him of his presidential aura. He wasn't a political prisoner. He was a criminal suspect. The charges were heavy. The Southern District of New York unsealed the indictment: narco-terrorism, conspiracy to flood the United States with cocaine, using the Venezuelan state as a weapon against America. That night, Nicolás Maduro slept in a cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. His neighbors were not diplomats, but high-profile inmates like R. Kelly and Ghislaine Maxwell. The revolution was over. The legal battle had begun. Back in Venezuela, the sun rose on a country in shock. The sonic shield had lifted, leaving behind a deafening silence. The people woke up to find their leader gone. In the power vacuum, a familiar face stepped forward. Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president and a staunch Maduro loyalist, was named interim president by the Supreme Court. Publicly, she denounced the operation as a kidnapping. But behind closed doors, sources suggest she was given a stark choice by Washington: cooperate with the transition or face a second wave of strikes that would target the remaining leadership. We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. The US declaration was blunt. America would run the country. They announced plans to bring in US oil majors to rebuild the shattered energy infrastructure. It was a de facto receivership. This left the Democratic opposition in a precarious position. Maria Corina Machado, who had claimed victory in the 2024 elections, demanded her win be honored. The hour of freedom has come, she declared. But Washington seemed more interested in stability than immediate democracy, sidelining the very people who had fought for freedom. The capture didn't just destabilize Venezuela, it shook the entire continent. On the Colombian border, panic set in. Colombia, already hosting millions of Venezuelan refugees, braced for a tsunami. Authorities feared that without the central government's iron grip, Venezuela would fracture into fiefdoms ruled by warlords. Armed groups, the ELN, FARC, dissidents, and drug cartels began maneuvering to fill the void. The borderlands, always lawless, threatened to become a war zone. Across Latin America, the message was received with a chill. The United States had proven it was willing to decapitate a sovereign government to achieve its goals. Sovereignty was no longer a shield. Critics pointed to the hypocrisy. While Maduro was hunted down for narco-terrorism, the US had recently pardoned the former president of Honduras for similar crimes. The war on drugs, it seemed, was a weapon used selectively against enemies. Operation Absolute Resolve will be studied for generations. It marks the end of the era of massive land invasions. Why destroy a country with tanks when you can steal its leader with technology? The US proved that with enough audacity and air power, they could reach into the most fortified bedroom in South America and pluck out a president while the world was still waking up. Nicolás Maduro sits in a cell in Brooklyn, awaiting a trial that will likely last years. In Caracas, the oil pumps are starting to turn again under new management. The operation was a tactical masterpiece, but whether it brings freedom to Venezuela or just a new kind of occupation remains to be seen. If you enjoyed this deep dive into covert operations, you need to see our video on how the FBI dismantled another domestic threat from the inside. Click here to watch how the FBI infiltrated the KKK, to see how undercover agents exposed the Klan's darkest secrets.